The U.S. government secretly tested radiation on its own citizens, not enemy soldiers, not prisoners of war, but ordinary Americans, mothers, babies, soldiers who trusted orders, patients who believed their doctors. For decades, this truth stayed buried under classified stamps and locked metal cabinets. No headlines, no warnings, no apologies, only silence. And that silence lasted for years, until the files were finally opened. What they revealed shocked even the historians who thought they had seen it all. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. This is the story of secret radiation tests on American citizens. Welcome to Untold Golden History. Today, we uncover one of the most heartbreaking and disturbing chapters hidden inside America's Cold War past. A story of fear, power, cruelty, and innocence. A story where science crossed moral lines. A story where human lives were treated like test samples. And a story that still raises one painful question. How far can a government go in the name of national security? The story begins not with evil intentions, but with fear, deep, paralyzing fear. It was the late 1940s. World War II had ended, but peace did not follow. Instead, a new enemy appeared, one that could not be seen. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb. America panicked. The nuclear age had begun. Scientists warned that the next war would not be fought with guns alone. It would be fought with radiation, fallout, invisible death drifting through the air. The U.S. government believed it had only one choice: prepare at any cost. Inside government labs, military bases, and hospitals, a dangerous idea slowly took shape. To protect the nation, they needed data, real data. How radiation affected the human body. How much exposure could a person survive? How long before symptoms appeared? Could soldiers fight after radiation exposure? Could civilians survive a nuclear blast? These questions demanded answers, but there was a problem. Animal testing was not enough. Simulations were unreliable. The government wanted certainty, and certainty meant human experiments. At first, the discussions stayed secret. Scientists met behind closed doors. Military officials signed classified memos. Lawyers debated consent laws quietly. Somewhere along the way, morality became flexible. The reasoning was simple and terrifying. If a nuclear war happens, millions will die anyway. Testing on a few thousand now could save millions later. It sounded logical on paper. It sounded patriotic, but on the ground, it meant betrayal. One of the earliest victims was a baby. In 1946, at a hospital in Tennessee, a newborn named Elmer Allen was given radioactive iodine. His mother had no idea. Doctors told her it was a harmless test. She trusted them. Why wouldn't she? They wore white coats. They spoke calmly. They smiled. Years later, Elmer developed severe health problems. Only decades afterward did his family learn the truth. The test was part of a government-funded study to track how radioactive iodine moved through the human body, using babies as living instruments. This was not an isolated case. Across the country, similar experiments were happening quietly. In hospitals, poor patients were injected with plutonium without consent. Many were terminally ill, chosen because doctors believed they would die soon anyway. But some lived much longer than expected, carrying radioactive material inside them for years. No one told them, no one monitored them properly. They were discharged and forgotten. In one chilling case, a man named Eb Cade, an African-American construction worker, was injected with plutonium after a car accident. Doctors did not ask his permission. They simply decided his life was expendable. His body became a walking experiment. His suffering went unrecorded. His consent never mattered. At military bases, soldiers faced a different fate. Thousands were ordered to stand near nuclear test sites in Nevada and the Pacific. They were told it was safe. They were told to turn their backs, cover their eyes, and crouch. Then the bombs exploded. Bright white light, shock waves, heat. Radiation washed over them like an invisible storm. Some soldiers watched mushroom clouds rise into the sky, not knowing that the dust falling back down was poisoning them. Many fell sick years later: leukemia, thyroid cancer, birth defects in their children. The government denied responsibility. Records were missing. Orders were vague. Proof was hard to find. Veterans were left to fight not only disease, but bureaucracy. The most heartbreaking victims were civilians living near test sites. In Utah, Arizona, and Nevada, families noticed strange patterns. Sheep were born deformed, children got sick, cancer rates climbed, mothers miscarried. Locals called themselves Downwinders, living under the path of radioactive fallout. For years, officials assured them there was no danger. The radiation levels were within safe limits. Trust us, they said. But the government knew better. Internal documents showed that officials were tracking fallout carefully. They knew exactly where radioactive clouds were drifting. They knew civilians were being exposed. They chose silence. Evacuations were considered but rejected. Public panic was seen as the greater threat than radiation itself. Time passed. Decades passed. Victims grew old. Some died without ever knowing why they suffered. Others suspected the truth but had no proof. The Cold War ended. Files gathered dust. Scientists retired. Politicians moved on. The story seemed buried forever. Then, in the 1990s, everything changed. Public pressure forced the government to open its archives. President Bill Clinton ordered an investigation. Committees were formed. Boxes of documents were unsealed. What investigators found confirmed the worst fears. Thousands of secret radiation experiments had been conducted on American citizens without informed consent. The truth was no longer deniable. Families read reports describing tests done on their loved ones, dates, dosages, names, cold technical language describing human pain. For many, it was the first time their suffering had an explanation. For others, it reopened wounds that never healed. The government issued apologies. Compensation programs were created, but they came too late for many. Money could not bring back the dead. Apologies could not erase decades of denial. Trust, once broken, was impossible to fully restore. This dark chapter forced America to confront a painful realization. Fear can corrupt even democratic systems. Secrecy can turn science into cruelty. And when power goes unchecked, innocence pays the price. Yet from this tragedy came change. Ethics rules were rewritten. Informed consent became law. Institutional review boards were created to protect research subjects. These safeguards exist today because people suffered in silence yesterday. Their pain was not meaningless. Their story became a warning that progress without humanity is dangerous, that security without ethics leads to abuse, and that history must be remembered, not to shame the past, but to protect the future. But the full story is far from over, because behind every document lies a human face, a family, a forgotten voice, and many of those voices are only now being heard.
For many victims, the damage did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, quietly, like a shadow growing longer every year. At first, it was just fatigue, a strange weakness that never fully went away. Then came unexplained pain. Doctors blamed stress, diet, genetics, anything but radiation. The truth was hidden so deeply that even the victims themselves could not imagine it. Take the story of Louise Rice. She was a respected researcher at Vanderbilt University, working on nutrition studies in the 1940s. But what most people did not know was that her research involved feeding radioactive iron to pregnant women without telling them. These women were told they were part of a vitamin study. Many were poor, many were young. They trusted authority. Their babies absorbed radioactive material before they were even born. Years later, those children faced mysterious illnesses, their lives shaped by something that happened before their first breath. One of those children grew up wondering why she was always sick, why her bones felt weak, why her energy vanished so quickly. Doctors gave no clear answers. It was not until the declassified files came out that she learned the truth. Her mother had unknowingly agreed to a radiation experiment. The betrayal cut deeper than the illness itself. It was not just her body that had been damaged, it was trust. In another corner of America, in Rochester, New York, hospital patients became silent test subjects. Doctors injected plutonium into their veins to see how it spread through the body. Plutonium, one of the most toxic substances known to man. These patients were never told. Many were working-class citizens who believed hospitals existed to heal, not harm. Some were labeled as terminal to justify the experiments, but medical records later showed that several could have lived much longer if left untreated. One woman, injected without consent, survived for decades. For decades, she carried radioactive poison inside her bones. No one monitored her properly. No one warned her family. When she finally died, her body was studied again, still without permission. Even in death, she was not free. The cruelty did not always come from hatred. Often it came from cold calculation. Scientists wrote notes describing subjects as useful data. Military planners talked about acceptable losses. Human lives were reduced to numbers, charts, graphs. Somewhere between the equations, compassion disappeared. Children suffered perhaps the most tragic fate. At schools for disabled children, radiation experiments were disguised as nutritional research. Kids were fed radioactive oatmeal to track digestion. They laughed, they played, they trusted the adults watching them. Those adults took notes while invisible particles damaged young bodies, still learning how to grow. Parents were told nothing. Years later, when cancer rates rose among former students, questions surfaced, but answers were denied. Records were classified. The truth remained buried. Then there were the soldiers. Young men barely out of high school, eager to serve their country. They stood in the desert heat of Nevada, watching the sky glow brighter than the sun. They were ordered to march toward Ground Zero after explosions. Some were told it was safe training. Others were told nothing at all. Radiation dust settled on their skin, their lungs, their uniforms. They brushed it off like sand. Decades later, those same men sat in hospital waiting rooms, holding test results they did not understand. Cancer, tumors, genetic damage passed to their children. Many filed claims with the government. Most were rejected. Officials demanded proof that radiation caused their illness, proof that had been classified, proof locked away by the same system denying them help. Families watched loved ones fade slowly, strong soldiers reduced to fragile patients. Wives became caregivers, children grew up fast, medical bills piled up, the sense of injustice burned quietly, year after year. In Utah, the Downwinders faced a similar fate. Farmers noticed their sheep dying in large numbers after nuclear tests. Wool fell out, organs failed. Children played in contaminated dust, not knowing it carried death. Mothers washed radioactive dirt from clothes. Families drank contaminated milk. Government officials knew. Internal reports warned of danger, yet public statements continued to reassure. There is no risk, they said. Everything is under control. The people believed them. Why wouldn't they? It was their government, their protectors. Cancer did not arrive immediately. It waited 10 years, 20 years, then it struck. Leukemia in children, thyroid cancer in teenagers, entire families affected across generations. Funerals became common, fear spread quietly. One mother lost 3 children to cancer. 3. She buried them one by one, never knowing why fate had been so cruel. When the truth came out decades later, the realization broke her. Her children were not victims of chance, they were victims of secrecy. Some victims tried to speak out earlier. They were dismissed, labeled paranoid, unpatriotic. During the Cold War, questioning the government was dangerous. Silence was safer. But silence came at a cost. As years passed, guilt slowly crept into the system. Scientists who once believed they were serving a greater good began to question their actions. Some wrote private letters expressing regret. Others carried the weight quietly to their graves. Then came the moment of reckoning. When declassification finally happened, investigators were stunned by the scale. Thousands of experiments, thousands of victims, decades of deception. The narrative of progress was shattered by the reality of suffering. Public outrage followed. Media reports spread. Survivors came forward. Faces replaced numbers. Stories replaced statistics. America was forced to look at itself in the mirror. Congress held hearings. Victims testified. Voices shook. Tears fell. Some spoke for the first time about pain they had carried their entire lives. Others spoke on behalf of the dead. The government admitted wrongdoing. Words like regret and mistakes filled official statements, but many victims felt those words were hollow. Accountability was limited. Punishments were rare. Most responsible parties were already gone. Compensation programs were created, but they were slow and complex. Victims had to prove exposure, prove illness, prove causation. Many failed. Many died waiting. Still, something important had changed. The truth was no longer hidden. History had spoken. And with truth came a realization that patriotism should never demand blind obedience, that science must never abandon ethics, that secrecy, when left unchecked, can destroy lives. But the story does not end with anger alone. Some victims found peace in being heard, in knowing their suffering mattered, in knowing future generations would be protected by the lessons written in their pain. Their lives became warnings etched into policy. Their voices reshaped research laws. Their struggle built safeguards that exist today. But scars remain, in families, in communities, in the nation's conscience. Because once trust is broken at that scale, it never fully returns. And as more files continue to surface, one question still echoes through history. How many stories remain untold?
For years, the truth lived inside locked rooms, inside metal filing cabinets stamped with the word classified in red ink, inside reports that few people were ever meant to read. The victims felt something was wrong, but they did not know where to look. The answers were hidden behind national security laws, buried under fear of embarrassment, lawsuits, and international shame. The Cold War had taught America one thing above all else: secrecy was power. But secrecy has a weakness: time. As decades passed, the fear that once justified silence began to fade. The Soviet Union collapsed. Nuclear war no longer felt imminent. Younger generations started asking uncomfortable questions. Journalists dug deeper. Survivors refused to stay quiet. What once sounded like whispers slowly grew into demands. By the late 1980s, pressure reached a breaking point. Investigative reporters began uncovering fragments of the truth. A leaked memo here, a forgotten report there. Patterns emerged. Radiation tests, human subjects, no consent. Every discovery raised another question. If this much was true, what else was hidden? The government denied wrongdoing at first. Officials claimed experiments were misunderstood, that standards were different back then, that everything had been done for national defense. But the explanations no longer satisfied the public. Then came lawsuits. Victims and their families took the government to court. They demanded documents. They demanded answers. Judges ordered limited disclosures. Agencies resisted. Files were lost. Pages were blacked out. Entire sections were missing. Still, the wall began to crack. In 1993, President Bill Clinton took office. Unlike his predecessors, he faced a public no longer willing to accept silence. Advocacy groups brought survivors directly to Washington. Veterans testified. Downwinders shared medical records. Mothers showed photos of children lost too soon. Clinton listened. In 1994, he ordered a full review of human radiation experiments conducted by the U.S. government. For the first time, agencies were forced to open their archives. Scientists, historians, and ethicists were granted access to decades of classified material. What they found was worse than anyone expected. Boxes upon boxes of documents revealed experiments dating back to the 1940s. The language inside was chillingly calm. Subjects were described as materials. Exposure levels were discussed like weather conditions. Risks were acknowledged privately, even as public statements denied danger. Some documents admitted that consent was never obtained. Others openly debated whether informing subjects was necessary. In one memo, an official wrote that public knowledge could cause unnecessary alarm. Human suffering was weighed against political convenience and lost. One particularly disturbing report detailed plutonium injections given to patients across several states. Names, dates, dosages, follow-up notes. In some cases, scientists tracked how long radioactive material stayed in bones until the subject died. The word death appeared as just another data point. Historians reading these files felt sick. These were not rogue scientists acting alone. These were coordinated programs funded and approved at the highest levels. Military, medical institutions, universities, all connected, all silent. As more information became public, the media exploded. Headlines shocked the nation. News anchors struggled to maintain composure. Americans watched in disbelief as their government's past actions unfolded on television screens. How could this happen, people asked. The answer was not simple. Fear had played its part. So had ambition. So had arrogance. During the early nuclear age, scientists were treated like heroes. Their discoveries had ended World War II. Their knowledge was seen as sacred. Questioning them felt unpatriotic. Oversight was minimal. Ethics committees barely existed. Progress mattered more than people. And so the system failed. Congressional hearings followed. Survivors were invited to testify. Some were elderly, walking slowly toward microphones with the help of family members. Others spoke through tears. Their voices shook, not from weakness, but from years of bottled pain. One man described standing near a nuclear blast as a young soldier. He remembered the heat, the shock wave, the silence afterward. He remembered being told it was safe. He remembered trusting that lie. Then he described holding his dying child decades later, wondering if he was to blame. Silence filled the room. Lawmakers shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided eye contact. Others wiped their eyes. The human cost was no longer abstract. It sat right in front of them. The final report confirmed what victims had always suspected. The government had knowingly exposed citizens to radiation without informed consent. It admitted ethical violations, it acknowledged suffering, but it also used careful language, avoiding words like crime or intentional harm. For many survivors, the report brought mixed emotions: relief that the truth was finally known, anger that it had taken so long, grief for those who did not live to see justice. The government issued a formal apology. The words were spoken in official rooms, recorded for history. Regret was expressed, promises were made, compensation programs expanded, rules were strengthened. But apologies cannot rewrite the past. Some families refused compensation, calling it blood money. Others accepted, needing help with medical bills. Many felt trapped between dignity and survival. Meanwhile, the scientific community faced its own reckoning. Universities reviewed their roles. Some removed names of involved researchers from buildings. Ethics training became mandatory. Institutional review boards were empowered to oversee experiments involving humans. Consent forms became detailed, transparent. These changes saved countless lives in the future, but they came at a terrible price. The radiation experiments became a lesson taught in medical schools, a warning about what happens when science forgets humanity. Students read about it with disbelief. How could doctors betray patients? How could a democracy allow this? The answer lay in one word: fear. Fear of enemies, fear of weakness, fear of losing power. And fear, when left unchecked, leads to karma. Years after the declassification, some officials involved expressed remorse. Interviews surfaced where retired scientists admitted they had doubts even then. They convinced themselves they were doing the right thing, that history would thank them. History did not. Their legacy became one of caution, not praise. For the victims, realization came slowly. Understanding why they suffered did not erase the pain, but it gave it meaning. Their struggles were no longer random. They were part of a larger truth. Some survivors turned their anger into activism. They spoke at schools. They testified before lawmakers. They ensured the story would not fade again into silence, because silence had already stolen too much. Yet, even after all this, questions remained. Were all the files released, or only the ones deemed safe? Were their experiments still hidden, stories still buried? Historians suspect the full truth may never be known, but what is known is enough to haunt a nation, enough to remind us that power without accountability is dangerous, that good intentions can lead to cruel outcomes, and that progress built on secrecy will always demand a price. As the country tried to move forward, the scars of the past lingered, in broken families, in poisoned lands, in the quiet fear that trust once shattered is hard to rebuild. And in that fear lies the final lesson. A government's true strength is not measured by what it can hide, but by what it dares to admit.
Long after the hearings ended and the headlines faded, the damage continued to live on. Inside bodies, inside families, inside memories. Radiation does not disappear when files are declassified. It lingers in bones, in bloodlines, in stories whispered at dinner tables and hospital corridors. For many families, the suffering did not end with one generation. It was passed down, quietly and cruelly. Children of victims grew up watching parents battle illnesses that doctors struggled to explain. Some learned early how to read medical charts instead of storybooks. Hospitals felt more familiar than playgrounds. Birth defects appeared without warning. Rare cancers surfaced in young adults. Doctors spoke carefully, never quite saying the word radiation, even when it hovered in the air like an unspoken truth. One daughter remembered her father, a former soldier, waking up screaming in the middle of the night. He never talked about the nuclear tests, never described the flash or the heat. He simply said his bones hurt. He died before the truth came out. When the files were released, she read his name on a list of exposed soldiers. She cried, not only for his death, but for the years he spent believing his suffering was his own weakness. That realization hit thousands like her. Entire communities carried shared trauma. In downwinder towns, cancer was so common it became normalized. Funerals felt routine. People joked darkly about the family illness, not knowing it had a source. When confirmation finally came, anger mixed with grief. Some felt relief, at least they were not imagining it. Others felt betrayed all over again. Land itself carried scars. In parts of Nevada and Utah, soil remained contaminated. Warning signs appeared years too late. Some areas were fenced off, declared unsafe for habitation. Homes lost value. Families moved away, leaving behind memories and graves. The earth remembered what humans tried to forget. The concept of karma began to surface in public discussions, not in a mystical sense, but as moral consequence. Decisions made in secrecy came back in waves of lawsuits, public distrust, and damaged credibility. Institutions once respected faced skepticism. People questioned authority more openly. Trust, once broken, changed the relationship between citizens and government forever. Science, too, was forced to slow down. Researchers became cautious. Ethical approval processes grew strict. Consent forms expanded from a page to entire packets. Experiments took longer. Progress felt slower. Some complained. Others remembered the cost of speed without conscience. Medical students studied the radiation experiments not as achievements, but as warnings. Professors paused during lectures, letting silence emphasize the weight of history. The message was clear: intelligence without ethics is dangerous. Still, not everyone accepted responsibility. Some officials defended their actions even years later. They argued the world was different then, that fear justified choices, that hindsight was unfair. But these explanations rang hollow to those who buried children, who carried illness without answers, who were never given a choice. For victims, healing was complicated. Support groups formed. Survivors shared stories with others who understood without explanation. They talked about pain, about anger, about guilt. Many wrestled with a haunting thought: if they had known earlier, could something have been different? Could lives have been saved? Psychologists called it delayed trauma, the shock of discovering harm long after it occurred. Learning that suffering had a cause reopened wounds. Some spiraled into depression. Others found strength in knowledge. Truth, even painful truth, offered a strange kind of relief. A few survivors chose forgiveness, not because the harm was small, but because holding anger felt heavier than letting go. They spoke publicly about healing, about ensuring history would not repeat itself. Their voices carried a quiet power. Meanwhile, activists pushed for more transparency. They demanded full disclosure of remaining classified documents. They called for environmental cleanup. They fought for broader compensation. Some succeeded, others hit walls of bureaucracy and silence. The government responded slowly, cautiously. Each admission risked lawsuits, each release risked reputation, but the pressure did not stop. Generational conversations changed. Parents warned children to question authority. Teachers encouraged critical thinking. Patriotism evolved from blind loyalty to informed responsibility. Loving a country no longer meant ignoring its flaws. That shift became one of the lasting legacies of the radiation experiments. America began to understand that strength lies not in perfection, but in accountability. Internationally, the revelations damaged moral authority. Other nations pointed to the experiments as proof that no superpower is immune to corruption. Human rights organizations cited the cases as examples of state abuse. America, once the judge, found itself on trial in the court of global opinion. Yet even in that shame, there was growth. The exposure of wrongdoing helped shape international research ethics. Global standards for human experimentation improved. Informed consent became a universal principle. Oversight committees gained power worldwide. Countless future abuses were prevented because someone dared to expose the past. For victims, healing was complicated. Support groups formed. Survivors shared stories with others who understood without explanation. They talked about pain, about anger, about guilt. Many wrestled with a haunting thought. If they had known earlier, could something have been different? Could lives have been saved? Psychologists called it delayed trauma, the shock of discovering harm long after it occurred. Learning that suffering had a cause reopened wounds. Some spiraled into depression. Others found strength in knowledge. Truth, even painful truth, offered a strange kind of relief. A few survivors chose forgiveness, not because the harm was small, but because holding anger felt heavier than letting go. They spoke publicly about healing, about ensuring history would not repeat itself. Their voices carried a quiet power. Meanwhile, activists pushed for more transparency. They demanded full disclosure of remaining classified documents. They called for environmental cleanup. They fought for broader compensation. Some succeeded, others hit walls of bureaucracy and silence. The government responded slowly, cautiously. Each admission risked lawsuits. Each release risked reputation. But the pressure did not stop. Generational conversations changed. Parents warned children to question authority. Teachers encouraged critical thinking. Patriotism evolved from blind loyalty to informed responsibility. Loving a country no longer meant ignoring its flaws. That shift became one of the lasting legacies of the radiation experiments. America began to understand that strength lies not in perfection, but in accountability. Internationally, the revelations damaged moral authority. Other nations pointed to the experiments as proof that no superpower is immune to corruption. Human rights organizations cited the cases as examples of state abuse. America, once the judge, found itself on trial in the court of global opinion. Yet even in that shame, there was growth. The exposure of wrongdoing helped shape international research ethics. Global standards for human experimentation improved. Informed consent became a universal principle. Oversight committees gained power worldwide. Countless future abuses were prevented because someone dared to expose the past. For victims, healing was complicated. Support groups formed. Survivors shared stories with others who understood without explanation. They talked about pain, about anger, about guilt. Many wrestled with a haunting thought. If they had known earlier, could something have been different? Could lives have been saved? Psychologists called it delayed trauma, the shock of discovering harm long after it occurred. Learning that suffering had a cause reopened wounds. Some spiraled into depression. Others found strength in knowledge. Truth, even painful truth, offered a strange kind of relief. A few survivors chose forgiveness, not because the harm was small, but because holding anger felt heavier than letting go. They spoke publicly about healing, about ensuring history would not repeat itself. Their voices carried a quiet power. Meanwhile, activists pushed for more transparency. They demanded full disclosure of remaining classified documents. They called for environmental cleanup. They fought for broader compensation. Some succeeded, others hit walls of bureaucracy and silence. The government responded slowly,
Cautiously. Each admission risked lawsuits. Each release risked reputation. But the pressure did not stop. Generational conversations changed. Parents warned children to question authority. Teachers encouraged critical thinking. Patriotism evolved from blind loyalty to informed responsibility. Loving a country no longer meant ignoring its flaws. That shift became one of the most lasting legacies of the radiation experiments. America began to understand that strength lies not in perfection, but in accountability. Internationally, the revelations damaged moral authority. Other nations pointed to the experiments as proof that no superpower is immune to corruption. Human rights organizations cited the cases as examples of state abuse. America, once the judge, found itself on trial in the court of global opinion. Yet, even in that shame, there was growth. The exposure of wrongdoing helped shape international research ethics. Global standards for human experimentation improved. Informed consent became a universal principle. Oversight committees gained power worldwide. Countless future abuses were prevented because someone dared to expose the past. For some families, justice came in unexpected ways. A granddaughter of a test subject became a lawyer specializing in medical ethics. A son of a downwinder became a scientist focused on environmental safety. Pain transformed into purpose. Trauma became fuel for change. These were rays of hope, small but real. Memorials were built in some communities. Names were engraved, ceremonies held. Silence was replaced with remembrance. Children learned stories that had once been hidden. History was spoken aloud. Still, the question lingered. Was it enough? Many victims died without hearing an apology, without compensation, without recognition. Their suffering existed only in private memories and dusty files. For them, closure never came. And so the legacy remained unfinished. The radiation experiments left behind more than illness. They left behind distrust, caution, awareness. They reshaped how citizens view power and how power must answer to the people. They taught a harsh lesson. When fear leads decisions, innocence pays the price. Yet they also taught something else, that truth, no matter how long delayed, has a way of surfacing, that secrecy is fragile, and that even the darkest chapters can guide a nation toward a more ethical future if they are remembered. As the years continue to pass, survivors grow fewer, memories fade, new crises demand attention, but history waits patiently, ready to repeat itself if forgotten. And that is why this story matters. Not to reopen wounds, but to protect the future. Because the real legacy of these experiments is not radiation, it is awareness.
As the years moved forward, the story refused to stay buried. Even after official reports were published and apologies were issued, new revelations kept emerging, like echoes from a past that was not finished speaking. Each newly uncovered document felt like another door opening inside a dark hallway, revealing that the silence had been deeper and wider than anyone imagined. Some files showed experiments that were never mentioned in the main reports, smaller studies, short-term exposures, quiet hospital trials labeled under harmless names. Not enough to change the official conclusions, but enough to confirm a painful truth. The full scope of human radiation testing may never be completely known. For survivors, this realization was exhausting. Every time they believed the truth was finally out, another fragment surfaced, another reminder that secrecy had layers, that accountability had limits. Many began to understand that justice, in its pure form, might never arrive. Still, they tried. Legal battles continued. Aging victims sat through court hearings, their hands shaking, their voices soft but determined. Lawyers argued over technicalities. Government representatives spoke of statutes of limitations. Time itself became the strongest defense against responsibility. Some cases were dismissed, Others dragged on for years. A few ended in settlements, quiet agreements without admission of guilt. Families accepted them not because they felt fair, but because they were tired of fighting a system designed to outlast them. And yet, something remarkable happened during these struggles. Public awareness grew stronger. Documentaries were made, books were written. Teachers included the radiation experiments in history lessons. Students asked questions that previous generations never dared to ask. The story began to live outside courtrooms and government buildings. It entered living rooms, classrooms, and conversations. Survivors were invited to speak. An elderly woman stood before a group of students, holding a photograph of her younger self. She explained how she had trusted her doctors, how she had believed the government would never harm its own people. Her voice cracked when she described losing friends to cancer. When she finished, the room was silent, not because people did not know what to say, but because they finally understood. Moments like that became a form of justice, not the kind written into law, but the kind written into memory. Institutions attempted to repair their image. Universities issued statements distancing themselves from past research. Hospitals updated ethical codes. Government agencies promised transparency. But trust is not restored by policy alone. It requires humility, and humility was slow to come. Some former officials avoided interviews altogether. Others repeated the same defenses. We did what we thought was right. The context was different. The Cold War left no easy choices. To the victims, these words felt empty. Context did not erase consent. Fear did not justify deception. Patriotism did not excuse cruelty. And slowly, society began to agree. The radiation experiments became a symbol, a reminder of how easily power can cross lines when oversight disappears. They were cited in debates about modern surveillance, medical trials, and national security. The past became a warning sign posted at the edge of the future. For families who lost loved ones, memory became sacred. They created rituals, annual gatherings, quiet moments of remembrance. Some visited old test sites, standing on land that once carried invisible death. Others wrote letters to relatives who never knew the truth, explaining it as if they could still hear. Grief changed shape over time. It softened, it deepened, it turned into something closer to resolve. Many survivors reached a stage of realization, not acceptance of what happened, but acceptance of what could no longer be changed. They stopped asking why it happened and started asking what could be done with the truth. That question reshaped lives. One former Downwinder became an environmental activist, fighting against modern pollution. A veteran's son joined the military, determined to protect soldiers from the mistakes of the past. A nurse whose patients had been unknowingly tested dedicated her career to patient advocacy. Their choices did not erase the harm, but they honored it. And in that sense, karma unfolded not as punishment, but as responsibility passed forward. The nation, too, carried karma. Public trust in institutions never fully returned to its previous state. Skepticism became normal. Demands for transparency grew louder. Whistleblowers gained cultural respect. The idea that the government could be wrong, even dangerous, became part of public consciousness. This shift was uncomfortable, but necessary. Democracy matured. The radiation experiments forced America to confront a painful truth about itself, that good intentions do not guarantee good actions, that systems built to protect can also harm, and that accountability must exist even during moments of fear. As survivors aged, urgency increased. They worried that once they were gone, the story would fade again, that future generations would forget, that secrecy would once again feel convenient. To prevent this,
They recorded testimonies, donated documents, spoke until their voices weakened. They did not want sympathy, they wanted memory, and memory, when preserved, becomes protection. Today, ethics boards review research proposals carefully. Consent is mandatory. Transparency is expected. These safeguards exist because people once suffered without them. Their pain became the foundation of protection. But even now, questions remain unanswered. Were their experiments never recorded? Subjects never identified? Lives affected but never connected to a cause? Historians believe the answer is yes. Paper trails end. Names disappear. Silence still exists in corners. That uncertainty is part of the legacy. Not everything broken can be fixed. Not every story can be recovered. Some truths are lost forever. And yet, what remains is enough. Enough to remind us that progress must be guided by compassion, that fear should never outrun ethics, that power must always answer to humanity. As the last survivors step away from public life, their message remains clear. They were not just victims, they were witnesses. Witnesses to what happens when secrecy overrides dignity. Witnesses to the cost of ignoring consent. Witnesses whose lives changed history, not through choice, but through endurance. Their suffering forced a nation to pause, reflect, and change course. And that, perhaps, is the closest thing to justice they were ever meant to receive.
As time moved forward, silence slowly returned. Not the forced silence of secrecy, but the quiet that comes after truth has been spoken. The world changed. New threats emerged. New fears replaced old ones. But for those who lived through the radiation experiments, the past never truly stayed behind. It lived in medical records, in family photographs, in empty chairs at dinner tables. Some survivors spent their final years wondering if their suffering had meaning. They asked themselves whether their pain had saved anyone, whether the lessons learned were real, or whether history would simply repeat itself under a different name. These questions followed them to their last breath. Yet the answers existed, even if they were imperfect. Because after the radiation experiments were exposed, something fundamental shifted. The idea that the government could act without consent lost its moral shield. The assumption that authority automatically meant protection cracked. Citizens learned that loyalty did not require blindness, and trust did not mean silence. That realization reshaped a nation. Young doctors entering hospitals were taught not only how to heal, but how to listen, how to explain, how to respect choice. The phrase informed consent became sacred, not a formality, but a promise built on the suffering of people who were never given one. Researchers slowed down. Questions were asked before experiments began, not after damage was done. Ethics committees existed not to block progress, but to guide it. The system was no longer perfect, but it was awake. Families of victims carried forward their stories like fragile heirlooms. At kitchen tables, parents told children why questioning authority mattered. At schools, teachers explained how fear can distort judgment. At memorials, names were read aloud so they would not disappear into statistics again. These acts were small but powerful, because remembrance is resistance. The land itself began to heal, slowly. Cleanup efforts reduced contamination in some areas. Warning signs were replaced with memorial plaques. Former test sites became reminders, not secrets. Places once hidden behind fences became lessons carved into geography. And still, the emotional wounds remained. Some survivors never forgave. Others found peace in understanding. Many lived somewhere in between, accepting what happened without excusing it. Healing was not a straight path. It was personal, uneven, human.
As the last generation of direct victims aged, their presence became quieter, their voices softer, but their impact remained strong. They had changed laws, they had changed science, they had changed how power is questioned, and most importantly, they had changed how history is told. This story was no longer buried in classified files. It was spoken aloud, documented, taught, remembered. That alone was a victory against the silence that once consumed it. The radiation experiments revealed a painful truth about humanity itself, that under fear, even well-meaning systems can cause immense harm. But they also revealed something else. That truth, once uncovered, can force growth. That suffering, when acknowledged, can protect others. That darkness, when exposed, loses its power. This is where karma truly lived, not in punishment, but in consequence. The consequence of secrecy was suffering. The consequence of truth was change. And change, though slow and incomplete, became the final legacy of those experiments. They were not heroes by choice. They were not martyrs by design. They were ordinary people placed in extraordinary cruelty. And through that cruelty, they shaped a safer future. Their story is not meant to inspire fear. It is meant to inspire vigilance. Because the greatest danger is not science, or power, or progress. The greatest danger is forgetting. Forgetting that innocence must be protected. Forgetting that consent is sacred. Forgetting that humanity must always come before ambition. As long as this story is told, that forgetting will never fully happen. And that is why their suffering mattered. This is not just a chapter in American history. It is a warning written in human lives, and a promise that truth, no matter how long buried, will always find its way into the light. If this hidden truth shocked you, don't look away. Subscribe or follow Untold Golden History, because the stories they tried to bury still matter.